Hey guys, tonight, before we go anywhere at all, I want you to stop for just one moment and picture something. Picture a dance, not a grand ballroom, not chandeliers and white gloves, something smaller than that, something warmer. A log cabin in the Wisconsin woods in the early 1870s, somewhere so deep in the trees that the nearest neighbour is more than a mile away, and the sound of fiddle music is the loudest thing for miles in every direction. The floor is packed dirt, smoothed flat from years of use. Tallow candles throw orange light across the walls. The air smells of pine resin and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of people who have been working hard all week and are finally, tonight, allowed to rest. And in the middle of it all, a young man stands up and lifts a bugle to his lips. He's wearing a blue coat, an army coat. Though the brass buttons catch the candlelight, the children in the room go quiet because there is something about a man in a uniform, even a faded, worn-at-the-elbows uniform from a war that ended years ago, that makes children go still. He plays a few bright, piercing notes. People laugh. He grins. Later, a little girl named Laura tugs on her pa's sleeve. She wants to know about Uncle George. She wants to know why he acts the way he acts. Wild, people call him. A little reckless. A little too loud. A little like a man who used up his caution somewhere he can never go back and get it. And Pa leans down and tells her. He ran away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was only 14 years old. Laura was 4 years old at that dance. She carried that story for the rest of her life. She wrote it into a book 60 years later, Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932, and it became one of the most beloved details in the Little House series. Millions of children read it. Generations of readers picture Uncle George at that dance, bugle in hand, a former boy soldier who survived the war and came home just a little too full of something the war put in him that peace could never fully take back out. It is a beautiful story. There is only one problem. It is not true. Not in the way Laura told it. Not in the way generations of readers believed it. Not in the way that matters when you open the military records and look for a boy named George Whiting Ingalls and find, in line after line after line of carefully documented enlistments and service histories, absolutely nothing. His name is not there. And when you ask the question the other way, when you stop looking for the dramatic uncle and start looking for the real ones, the quiet ones, the ones Laura barely mentioned, something extraordinary happens. Two other brothers step out of the shadows. Two men whose names actually appear in the Union Army muster rolls. Two men who actually went to war and actually came home changed by it, in ways that were far less romantic and far more painful than a boy playing bugle at a country dance. Their names were Lansford James Ingalls and Hiram Lemuel Ingalls, and tonight their story finally gets told. Settle in. Dim the lights if you have not already. Let the weight of the day lift off your shoulders 1 degree at a time, because we're going to spend the next few hours in the 19th century. And that means we're going somewhere that has no electricity, no running water, no medicine worth the name, and a particular kind of cold in winter that modern people understand only as an abstraction. We're going somewhere that asks everything of the people who live there, and we're going to follow 4 brothers, Peter, Charles, James and Hiram, and their youngest sibling George, from the log cabins of Wisconsin through the bloodiest war the American continent had ever seen, and then back out the other side into the long, difficult, largely invisible aftermath that Laura Ingalls Wilder never put on the page. We are going to find out what was left between the lines. But before we can understand what was missing, we have to understand what was there. We have to go back to the beginning, to the family before the war, into the years when the Ingalls brothers were still just boys in New York, and the Civil War was not even a rumour, and no one had the first idea what it was going to cost them. The story of the Ingalls family begins, as so many American frontier stories do, in motion. Lansford Whiting. Ingalls was born in 1812 in upstate New York, in the quiet, forested hill country that stretches west from the Hudson Valley toward the Great Lakes. He married a woman named Laura Louise Colby, and together they raised 10 children, sons Peter, Charles, James, Hiram and George, along with daughters Lydia, Polly, Docia and Ruby, and one infant who did not survive. 10 children. And in an era when infant mortality meant that having 10 children was not ambition so much as arithmetic, you needed that many to be sure some survived, the Ingalls family was, in that precise sense, completely ordinary. What was not ordinary was what Lansford did next. He moved, and then he moved again, and then he moved again. This was the defining rhythm of the 19th century American frontier family, and the Ingalls family played it almost perfectly. New York to Illinois, Illinois to Jefferson County, Wisconsin. Each move chasing the dream that the next piece of land would be the one that finally held, the one that finally produced enough to stop the constant sliding feeling of financial precarity that Lansford and Laura Ingalls spent most of their adult lives fighting. By the mid-1850s, the family was settled on 80 acres along the Oconomowoc River in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. It was wooded country, good timber, cold winters, the kind of land that demanded everything from the people who worked it, and gave back just enough to keep them there. The older sons, Peter and Charles, were already grown or close to it. The younger ones, James, Hiram, and little George, were still boys. And Charles, the one who would become Pa, had just married Caroline Quiner, a quiet, steady woman from a neighbouring family, in February of 1860. The Quiners mattered. They were going to matter enormously for the rest of this story, because the Quiner family was already woven into the Ingalls family in ways that went deeper than one marriage. Henry Quiner, Caroline's brother, was married to Polly Ingalls, Pa's sister, and another Quiner brother, a young man named Joseph, would be among the first people in the extended family to go to war, but that comes later. For now, the important thing to understand about the Ingalls family in the late 1850s is this: they were not wealthy. They were not poor in the grinding, desperate way that some frontier families were poor, but they were the kind of family for whom every year of bad weather, every illness, every failed crop, every piece of equipment that broke at the wrong moment was a genuine emergency. Lansford had purchased his 80 acres along the Oconomowoc River, but by late summer of 1864, with the Civil War already raging for 3 years, that farm was sold at a sheriff's auction. Think about that for a moment. 3 years of war, 3 years of young men leaving and not coming back, 3 years of community grief and economic disruption, and still the farm slipped away. The ground that Lansford had worked and moved toward and worked again was gone. The brothers who had grown up on it were scattered. The family that had tried to put down roots in Wisconsin had lost its anchor. The brothers grew up in that environment. They grew up understanding, in the particular way that children absorb the emotional atmosphere of a household without being told anything directly, that the ground beneath them was never entirely stable. That security was something you worked toward and could still lose. That the adult world was not safe in the way children need the adult world to be safe. This matters because of what it meant when the war came. April 1861, Fort Sumter. The first shots of the Civil War. Wisconsin responded the way most of the northern states responded, with a surge of patriotic enlistment that was, at least in the first year or two, entirely genuine. Young men lined up at recruitment offices. Communities sent their sons off with speeches and flags and the particular tragic confidence of people who expect a short, victorious conflict and have never seen what sustained artillery fire does to a human body. The Ingalls family was directly in the middle of this. Charles Ingalls did not enlist. That is a fact worth sitting with, because it has been the subject of quiet debate among Wilder scholars for decades. He was 25 in 1861, in good health by all available evidence, with no documented physical reason for exemption. He signed a petition to raise local bounties for volunteers, which suggests civic engagement with the war effort, but he did not go himself. Why not? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. Some historians point to economic necessity. Someone had to farm the land, and Charles and Caroline had only recently married. Others note that Charles Ingalls spent his entire adult life making choices that prioritized family survival over abstract duty, and this may simply be the earliest example of that pattern. The records do not tell us what was in his mind. What they do tell us is that while Charles stayed, someone else from the family did not. Caroline's brother Joseph Quiner enlisted early. He was a young man in his early 20s when he mustered in. part of the wave of Wisconsin volunteers who went south full of confidence and came back broken, or did not come back at all. Joseph Quiner did not come back. He was wounded in the terrible, swampy, chaotic fighting near Shiloh in April of 1862, one of the bloodiest engagements of the first year of the war, a 2-day battle in Tennessee that left 23,000 men dead or wounded on both sides and shocked the northern public into understanding that this war was not going to be short and was not going to be clean. Joseph made it off the field. He was taken to a field hospital. He died of his wounds on April 28, 1862, just days after the battle ended. He was 22 years old. Carolyn Ingalls, Ma, as Laura would always call her, lost her brother in the spring of 1862. She was 26, with a young child and a husband who had not served, and a war that showed no sign of ending. Whatever she felt about Joseph's death, and about the war that had taken him, she kept private in the way that women of her generation and temperament kept most things private, behind steady eyes and capable hands and the daily work that did not stop just because your heart was breaking. But the death of Joseph Quiner was not an abstraction to the Ingalls family. It was a face. It was a name they knew. It was a kitchen chair where someone used to sit who would never sit there again. And it was a warning. As just the war ground on through 1862, 1863, 1864, the early surge of volunteers slowed and then stopped as the casualty list grew longer, and the initial enthusiasm curdled into something harder and less voluntary. The Union moved to drafts and bounties, offering cash payments to men who would enlist and legal penalties to men of eligible age who did not when their number came up. Wisconsin and Minnesota, the states where the Ingalls family was now split between, filled their quotas. They did it with young men from farming families who could not afford to buy their way out of service, and who went south and came back thin and sick and strange, or came back in boxes, or did not come back at all. The Ingalls brothers watched all of this. Peter, the eldest, had his own family by now and his own farm. Charles had Caroline and the girls, but James and Hiram were still young enough to be watching, and what they were watching was a world being permanently altered by something they could not escape. James Ingalls, Lansford. James Ingalls, to give him his full name, was born on March 14th, 1843. He was 21 when the war entered its final year. He was tall and steady and possessed of the kind of quiet stubbornness that seems to run through the Ingalls men like a second spine. Hiram Lemuel Ingalls was born on April 27th, 1848. He was 16 years old in 1865. 16. The importance of that number will become clear in just a moment. Hold on to it. By the autumn of 1864, something had shifted in the family. According to records examined and documented by the Pioneer Girl Project, the archival program based at the South Dakota State Historical Society that has done the most extensive comparative work on the real Ingalls family and the fictionalized version, it was Hiram who was determined to go. He was 16, he was restless, and the war had been the defining event of the world around him for his entire adolescence. He wanted to be part of it. He wanted to do something that mattered before it was over. And James, being the kind of older brother who apparently could not stand the idea of 16-year-old Hiram going off to war alone, decided to go with him. In early January of 1865, the two brothers did something that speaks to either their courage or their desperation or both. They slipped away from their families, crossed Lake Pepin, and travelled to Lake City, Minnesota, in Wabasha County, where a regiment was being formed. The regiment was the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery. On January 5th, 1865, James and Hiram Ingalls were recorded as privates in Company E of the 1st Regiment of Minnesota Heavy Artillery. Hiram listed his age as 19. He was 16. He looked his recruiter in the eye and added 3 years to his life without flinching, and the recruiter either believed him or was under enough pressure to fill the regiment's quota that he chose not to look too closely. And that is how a 16-year-old boy from Wisconsin went to war. James was 21 and enlisted honestly. His paperwork went through without difficulty. He was exactly the kind of man the Union Army needed in January of 1865. experienced with farm labour, physically strong, old enough to follow orders without excessive hand-holding, young enough to survive the conditions. The two brothers were assigned to Company E. They would serve together. They would go south together. They would come home together, though coming home would prove to be its own complicated kind of story. Back in Wisconsin, Charles Ingalls remained. He had now let two younger brothers go to war. He had already lost a brother-in-law. Whatever private calculus was happening inside him during those months, it left no trace in the written record. What we know is that he was there when Hiram and James were not. And young George Whiting Ingalls was 13 years old when the war ended in April 1865. He was not in the army. He was not near the army. He was a child on a Wisconsin farm, growing up in the long shadow of a conflict he had been too young to participate in and too old to entirely escape. After the war, he worked by family account on a ferry crossing Lake Pepin, married a woman named Julia Bard in 1876, and died in 1901, 1 year before his brother Charles. No pension application exists for him. None could have existed, which makes what Laura wrote about him 60 years later all the more interesting and all the more telling. Company E of the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery was organised at St. Paul in the late winter of 1865. In late February, they were sent by rail to Tennessee to the garrison at Chattanooga, the strategic rail hub that both armies had fought over in some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. By 1865, Chattanooga was firmly in Union hands, and the Heavy Artillery Regiment's job was to make sure it stayed that way. This means they were not in the last pitched battles of the war. They did not charge across open fields into Confederate rifle fire. They guarded forts. They maintained the heavy guns. They kept watch over a city that the Confederate army had been trying to take back, and that the Union could absolutely not afford to lose. This is the part of war that the stories tend not to tell. Not because it was easy, but because it was not dramatic in the way that a charge or a battle is dramatic. It was the long, grinding, exhausting, unglamorous work of maintaining a military position in a southern city in the last months of a war that had been tearing the country apart for 4 years. The food was inadequate, the sanitation was inadequate. Disease moved through the garrison the way it moved through every garrison in every war in every century before the germ theory of medicine arrived to give humanity even the most basic tools to fight back, invisibly, fatally, and without announcement. James Ingalls was reported present for every single roll call of Company E from the day he mustered in to the day he mustered out. He did not miss a day. He did his duty without complaint as far as any record shows for the entire length of his service. And when Company E was mustered out at Nashville on September 27th, 1865, the war having ended with Lee's surrender in April and Johnston's in May, James Ingalls walked out of the Union Army carrying something in his body that would not leave him for the rest of his life. The records describe it as chronic diarrhea. That is the clinical language, the 19th century's stripped-down way of saying, this man's digestive system was permanently damaged by something that happened in Tennessee, by the food or the water or the exposure or some combination of all three, and he was never going to be entirely well again. He came home thin. He came home pale. Family accounts, preserved in fragments through the scholarship of people who spent decades tracking down the real Ingalls family to compare them to the fictional one, describe a man who was simply and heartbreakingly said to be sick ever since he came out of the war, not dramatically wounded, not missing a limb, not carrying the visible, legible mark of a soldier's sacrifice, just sick, just thin, just permanently, quietly, undramatically altered by what the army had done to him. And Hiram had lied about his age to get in, survived the garrison service, and was discharged at Fort Snelling in Minnesota on September 27, 1865. He was 17 years old, barely older than when he'd left. Dillon, but separated from his adolescence by a year in Chattanooga in a way that could not be undone. These are the real brothers. These are the men Laura barely put on the page. These are the ones who went. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with the question before we move on. If you grew up hearing stories about your family, and one of the stories was about the uncle who ran away to be a drummer boy, the wild one, the exciting one, the one who played bugle at the dance in his worn army coat. Would you ever think to ask about the other uncle? The quiet one? The thin one? The one who came home from a place called Chattanooga with a sickness in his gut that would never fully go away? Would you think to ask what it cost that man to serve? Would you think to look for his name in the muster roll? Laura Ingalls Wilder did not. Or if she did, she made a different choice about which story to tell. And that choice, that single, consequential, deeply human act of selecting which truth to amplify and which to let fade, is what we are going to spend tonight unpacking. Because the story of the Ingalls brothers is not just a story about one family's relationship with one war. It is a story about how all of us remember the things that hurt us. It is a story about the myths we build to protect ourselves from the full weight of what survival actually costs. And it is a story about what happens decades later when someone finally turns on the lights in the room where the real story was kept. We are turning on those lights tonight. There is a particular cruelty in surviving a war that nobody talks about much. It is not the cruelty of the battlefield. That kind of cruelty has been documented, memorialized, written about in 10,000 books. No, the cruelty we are going to talk about right now is quieter than that, and in some ways harder to bear. It is the cruelty of coming home to a world that has moved on without you, a world that needs you to be functional again, immediately, because the fields do not care that you spent 7 months in Tennessee. The harvest does not wait. The winter does not ask whether you are ready. James Ingalls stepped off whatever transport brought him back from Nashville in the autumn of 1865 and walked back into a life that expected him to simply resume. He was 22 years old. He had joined the Union Army in January. He had served through the end of the war, through the long months of peace that were still somehow work, guarding positions, maintaining guns, watching a defeated Confederacy try to figure out what it was now. And then he had been released at Nashville on September 27th and sent back north, back to Wisconsin and Minnesota, back to the particular geography of his childhood. Except that geography was not what it had been. The family farm in Jefferson County was gone. You remember that. The sheriff's auction in the summer of 1864 while James was still in Chattanooga. The 80 acres along the Oconomowoc River, and the land where the brothers had grown up hauling water and splitting wood and doing the 10,000 anonymous tasks that kept a frontier farm alive. That land had slipped out of the family's hands while 2 of its sons were wearing Union blue. So James came home to a family in motion again. No anchor, no fixed address. The Ingalls, in their characteristic way, had moved on, pushed forward by necessity, and the returning veteran had to find them wherever they had landed. And then there was the matter of his body. What the army had done to James Ingalls was not visible the way a missing limb is visible. There was no wound that explained itself to strangers, no empty sleeve pinned up to remind people at a glance that this man had paid something. What James carried home from Chattanooga was internal, persistent, and in the medicine of 1865 almost entirely untreatable. The records call it chronic diarrhea. That phrase sounds almost mild, the way medical language always sounds mild when it is describing something that is in fact life-altering. What it meant in practice was this. James Ingalls' digestive system had been permanently damaged by something he encountered in the camps and forts of Tennessee. Contaminated water, inadequate food, exposure to illness in overcrowded conditions. And it was never going to fully recover. It meant that the physical work a frontier farmer needed his body to do every day, the lifting and hauling and enduring of cold and heat and wet that farm life in Wisconsin and Minnesota required, all of that was harder for James than it had been before. Some days it may have been impossible. Yeah, and he was not alone in this. The 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery lost 87 enlisted men to disease over the course of its service, not in battle, not from enemy fire, from the water and the food and the air of a garrison camp in Tennessee, the same garrison camp where James and Hiram had spent 7 months doing their duty. Many more came home suffering from scurvy and conditions that would never fully resolve. 87 men who never came home at all, and a regiment full of men who came home changed in ways no discharge paper could measure. Read that for a moment and let it sit. Family accounts recorded in the scholarship that came later, The careful, painstaking work of biographers and archivists who went looking for the real brothers behind Laura's storybook uncles describe James as thin, pale, the particular pallor of someone whose body is fighting a battle it cannot win, and the phrase that echoes through those accounts, simple as a stone dropped in water, is one that tells you everything you need to know about how his family saw him. Sick, ever since he came out of the war. Not hero's wound, not a medal story. Just a man who came home from a thing he volunteered to do, and who paid for that decision with his health for the rest of his life, quietly, without ceremony, in a country that was already moving on to the next thing. Now here is where the story becomes something more than one family's private grief. James Ingalls was not unusual. That is the fact that Civil War historians have spent decades trying to make the general public understand, with mixed success, because it runs against the grain of how we prefer to remember wars. We prefer the dramatic wound, the visible sacrifice, the story that makes the cost legible. But the Civil War's real damage to the men who fought it, and to the men who simply served in it, as James did, without firing a shot in anger, was overwhelmingly invisible. It was disease. It was dysentery and typhoid and malaria and infections that had no name yet. It was bodies permanently altered by a year or 2 years or 3 years in camps where clean water was a luxury and adequate food was a fantasy. And the men slept, crowded together in conditions that would spread illness through a regiment in a matter of weeks. More Union soldiers died of disease during the Civil War than died in combat. Read that again and let it sit. More men died sick than died fighting. More men came home permanently damaged by what they had eaten and drunk and breathed than came home permanently damaged by bullets. And yet the story America told itself about the Civil War was almost entirely about the battles, the charge, the flag, the dramatic sacrifice at Gettysburg or Antietam or Shiloh. The invisible men, the ones like James who survived the war but not entirely the army. Those men were largely written out of the national memory before the ink on the peace treaties was even dry. The doctors of the era had names for what the veterans came home carrying. Nostalgia, a debilitating withdrawal, and loss of function associated with prolonged displacement and exposure to death. Soldier's heart, the cardiac and anxiety symptoms we would today associate with sustained psychological stress. Acute mania, melancholia. Those terms covered everything from the physical wreckage of camp disease to what we would now recognise as the psychological aftermath of sustained danger and loss. The men themselves rarely used any of these words. Their self-descriptions where they survived tend toward the plain and the understated. James Ingalls had no word for what had happened to him. He only had the thin body and the persistent gut pain and the knowledge, which must have settled on him gradually over months and years, that the man he would have become, the man who went down to Lake City with his younger brother in January of 1865, full of the particular undefeated energy of a 21-year-old, was not going to be who came back. And what of Hiram? Hiram Lemuel Ingalls was discharged from the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery at Fort Snelling on September the 27th, 1865, the same day Company E was officially mustered out in Nashville. He was 17 years old. He had enlisted at 16 with a lie on his lips and a war that had already lasted 4 years behind him. He had gone to Chattanooga and come back, and he was, in the strictly physical sense, intact. No documented chronic illness in the records that have survived. But Hiram had been 16 when he left. There is something worth pausing over in that number. 16. He was, by any modern standard, a child. He was a boy who had grown up watching a war happen to the world around him, who had waited as long as 16-year-old boys can wait before doing something about the restlessness, and who had then walked into a recruitment office in Lake City, Minnesota, and added 3 years to his age without hesitation. He was not a drummer boy in the romantic fife and flag sense that American culture loved to imagine. He was a private in a heavy artillery regiment doing garrison work in a city in the aftermath of the bloodiest conflict on American soil. The work was grinding and unglamorous, and the company of men around him included soldiers who had been through things Hiram had never seen. He came home knowing things a 17-year-old should not yet know. What he did with that knowledge, no record shows in clean detail. The Pioneer Girl Project's careful archival work confirms that Hiram went on to build a functioning civilian life in the post-war years, without the persistent health problems that defined his older brother's experience. But here is the thing about being young when you go to war. The years you spend in service are years you do not spend becoming the person you might have been otherwise. Hiram went in at 16 and came out at 17. He did not go to school during that year. He did not court a girl during that year. He did not sit on a porch somewhere in Wisconsin in the autumn of 1864 and simply exist in the uncomplicated way that 17-year-olds are supposed to exist. He gave those months to a nation that needed them and got his discharge papers in exchange and went home. His name never made the books. Now let's talk about Charles, because in order to understand what the brothers' service meant to the family, you have to understand the man who stayed behind. Charles Ingalls, Pa, in every book Laura ever wrote, the warm and beloved centre of the Little House universe, was 29 years old when Hiram and James left for Lake City in January of 1865. He was healthy, he was capable, he had Carolyn and the children, but so did thousands of other men who enlisted anyway. He had the farm, but the family was already in the process of losing it. He did not go. He signed a petition supporting local bounties for men who would volunteer. He is listed in local records as having done his civic duty by that measure. And then he stayed home while his two younger brothers went south. The scholars who have studied this question most carefully are careful not to make Charles Ingalls into a coward, and neither will we. The records simply do not tell us why he did not serve, and it would be dishonest to supply an explanation the evidence does not support. Economic necessity may have played a role. Local arrangements between farming families, where one brother's staying allowed another's going, were not uncommon. We do not know. What we do know is this. When Hiram and James came back changed by the war, one carrying a body that would never be quite right again, one carrying the particular knowledge of a boy who had spent his 16th year in a garrison in Tennessee, Charles was the one who had been here the whole time, the one who stayed, the two who went. That creates a dynamic in a family. It has to. Even if nothing is ever said about it directly, even if no letter survives recording a single word of tension or guilt or resentment, the dynamic is there the moment the younger brothers walk back through the door. In the Little House books, none of this exists. Charles Ingalls is simply Pa, warm, musical, resourceful, endlessly capable. His brothers appear briefly in one or two scenes and are no more than supporting characters in the warm glow of pioneer childhood, which is Laura's right as a writer. She was not under any obligation to tell the complicated story. She was writing for children. She was writing from love. But she did make one choice that is worth examining very carefully. She made the one brother who actually never served the most famous one. Here is what George Whiting Ingalls' life actually looked like after the war. Born in 1851, the youngest of the brothers, a full 15 years younger than Peter, was just the eldest. George was 10 years old when Fort Sumter fell. He was 13 when Hiram and James enlisted. He was 14 when the war ended in April of 1865. He spent those years in the particular suspended animation of the very young in wartime. Old enough to understand that something enormous was happening, young enough to be excluded from it by the sheer fact of his age. After the war, he grew up in Wisconsin. He worked. Family law says he worked at some point on a ferry crossing Lake Pepin, the beautiful wide stretch of the Mississippi that separates Wisconsin from Minnesota. He married a woman named Julia Bard in 1876. He and Julia built a life in the local area steadily, without drama, without the westward motion that would define his brother Charles's family. He never applied for a Civil War pension. Of course he didn't. You cannot claim a pension for service you never rendered. Researchers who have looked carefully for any record of a George Ingalls in Union Army rosters have found candidates, men with similar names, but those men are definitively not George Whiting Ingalls. Their birth years are wrong, their enlistment locations are wrong, the biographical details do not align, and the Pioneer Girl Project, which has done the most thorough and systematic work on the Ingalls family's military history, is unequivocal. There is no verified Civil War service record for George Whiting Ingalls. He died in 1901, 1 year before his brother Charles, and somewhere in the space between his real life, ferry work, a Wisconsin farm, a marriage, an ordinary death at 50, and the figure in the blue army coat playing bugle at a country dance, a family myth was born. The question that matters tonight is, why? Why does a family attach a war story to a man who was not in the war? This is not a question unique to the Ingalls family. It has happened in virtually every family in American history, in every war, in every generation. The cultural pressure to connect the men you love to the honour and drama of wartime sacrifice is overwhelming, and it does not require conscious dishonesty. It simply requires a family that is telling stories out loud, stories that travel through generations from mouth to ear to memory, where the details that do not fit the emotional truth of the story quietly drop away. In the Ingalls family, the emotional truth that needed a story was this. George was wild, he was reckless, he was too loud, a little dangerous, a little like a man who had seen things that licensed him to live outside the ordinary rules. That quality needed an explanation, and the Civil War was the explanation that the culture of the post-war American frontier had ready-made for exactly this kind of man. The war made men wild, everyone knew that. The veterans at the local saloon were wild. The veterans who couldn't hold jobs were wild. The veterans who showed up at country dances with a light in their eyes that their wives couldn't quite reach were wild. The war had done it to them, so when the family needed to explain George's wildness, the war was there. It was the container into which the family poured what they could not otherwise name. It may not have been a lie that anyone decided to tell. It may simply have been a story that felt true, that felt like it explained something, and so it lived. And then Laura put it in a book, and then millions of children believed it. There is a moment in the scholarship on Little House in the Big Woods that I have been waiting to share with you since we started tonight. In one of the early manuscript fragments, the drafts and fragments scholars have compared against the published text, looking for the places where Wilder's original version of events differs from what eventually made it onto the printed page. There is a scene involving a question. Young Laura asks Uncle James, the real veteran, the thin and pale one, the one who came back sick from Chattanooga, whether he is wild. Like Uncle George, she means, like the man with the bugle. And James answers her. He says that he is pretty tame. Just that. Pretty tame. 3 words. A small, quiet, almost dismissive self-description from a man who had actually served, who had actually gone south with his teenage brother in the last winter of the bloodiest war the country had ever fought, who had actually come back with something in his body that would never leave. Pretty tame. That line did not make the published book. Think about what it would have meant if it had. Think about what it would have done to Uncle George's story if the book had included somewhere near the bugle and the dance and the brass buttons, a quiet moment in which the actually sick, actually veteran brother dismisses his own service as ordinary, as unremarkable. Think about what young readers would have understood, even if only half-consciously, about the gap between the dramatic war story and the quiet suffering of the real one. Laura did not include it, and we cannot know whether she left it out deliberately, whether Rose Wilder Lane's editorial hand removed it, whether the publishers at Harper felt it disrupted the tone of a children's book. We simply do not know. What we know is that it was there once, in an early version of the story, and then it was not. So now we have 3 men. James, who went and came back broken and called himself pretty tame. Hiram, who went as a child and came back a year older and largely invisible in the family record. And George, who did not go, and who became, in his sister-in-law's books, the most famous of them all. That contrast is not just interesting, it is the entire story. It tells us something about how the Ingalls family processed the war. It tells us something about how Laura Ingalls Wilder processed her own childhood. She was born in February of 1867, 2 years after the war ended. She could not remember it. But she grew up in a family where the war was present in the body of one uncle and absent from the record of another, and where Pa's quiet non-service was something no one apparently discussed in front of the children, And where the stories that got told, the ones Pa played on the fiddle, the ones Ma kept in their proper place beside the fire, were the stories that could survive being told. We make them manageable. We find the story that can be told in a room full of children without stopping the music. We preserve the laughter and the candlelight and the bugle, and we let the quiet suffering of the thin man in the corner fade into the background of the scene. We tell the story that can be carried forward. James's story, the real cost, the real body, the real months of a young man's vitality given over to a garrison in Tennessee and never fully returned, was not a story that could be carried forward into a children's book in 1932 without changing everything. So it wasn't. And James disappeared from the page, and the war went with him, and in his place stood a young man in a blue coat with brass buttons, and the dance went on, and the fiddle played, and the candles burned, and the night was warm and safe, and nothing was broken and nothing was missing, except, of course, for what was. There is one more thing you need to know about this world before we can understand the next layer of this story, because the Ingalls family did not exist in isolation. They were not unique. They were one family in a vast sea of northern families who absorbed the Civil War's weight in exactly this way. Not through famous battles, not through dramatic sacrifice, but through the slow, grinding, everyday consequences of sending their sons away and getting back something other than what they sent. In the Wisconsin and Minnesota communities where the Ingalls family lived, the end of the Civil War did not feel like victory so much as it felt like a counting. You counted who came back. You counted who came back different. You counted who did not come back at all. And then you got to work. Because the harvest didn't wait and the winter was coming, and whatever you felt about any of it was going to have to wait until there was time to feel things, which on a frontier farm in 1865 meant it was probably going to wait a very long time. This is the emotional atmosphere that young Laura Ingalls grew up breathing. She was 7 years old the first time she saw Uncle George at that dance. She was 7 when he lifted the bugle. She was 7 when Pa leaned down and told her about the drummer boy. And that 7-year-old girl took the story she was given and held it for 60 years, and then she opened it up and put it on the page. She did not know what the record said. Or if she did, if some part of the adult woman who had spent her life knowing the family better than anyone still alive knew that George's story was more complicated than Pa's version. She made the choice that writers make when the emotional truth of a thing and the historical truth of a thing pull in different directions. She chose the version that could be loved. That choice deserves neither contempt nor uncritical acceptance. It deserves exactly what we are giving it tonight. A long, careful, honest look. And that look is going to take us somewhere, over the hours ahead, that Laura's book never goes. We're going to follow James as he tries to rebuild a life around a body that won't cooperate, in a country that has no real system for helping him do it. We're going to watch George grow up in the post-war world and understand what it might have meant to be the youngest brother, the one who missed it, in a family where the war was the defining event of the generation above him. We're going to walk through the writing of Little House in the Big Woods alongside Laura and her daughter Rose, and we're going to look carefully at every choice that was made about which relatives made the page and which were left out. And we are going to end up somewhere very specific. A manuscript fragment. A sentence. A moment in which the quiet suffering of a real veteran almost made it into one of the most beloved children's books in American history. Almost, but not quite. Stay with me. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was 63 years old before she wrote a single word of a book. Let that land for a moment. Most of the authors whose names you know had published their significant work by their 40s, sometimes their 30s. Laura spent her 60s sitting at a table in a farmhouse in the Ozarks of Missouri, in pencil, on cheap school tablets, writing down her childhood from memory. And when she finally did write it, what came out first was not the books you know. What came out first was something rawer, truer, and considerably harder to hold. She called it Pioneer Girl. It was an adult memoir, not a children's book, not a series, not the warm, carefully shaped narrative that would eventually make her one of the most widely read authors in American history. Pioneer Girl was the actual account, the unvarnished one. The version where the hardships were harder and the silences were louder, and the things that happened to the family were not softened by the knowledge that everything was going to be all right in the end. She wrote it in the late 1920s and finished it in 1930. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was by that point an accomplished journalist and writer in her own right, typed the manuscript and submitted it to a publisher in 1930. It was declined. Rose submitted it again in May of 1931, and then the two women waited, all summer, into the autumn. Rose wrote in her diary on September 11th, 1931, feeling dull and sunk, the particular despair of someone who knows they have something real and cannot get the world to agree. And then, in November of 1931, Harper Brothers said yes, but not to Pioneer Girl. What Harper accepted was something different, something Rose had pulled from her mother's raw memoir and reshaped, repackaged, retitled. She'd taken Pa's stories, specifically the ones Charles Ingalls used to tell, around the fire on winter evenings in the big woods of Wisconsin, and rebuilt them as children's fiction. Little House in the Big Woods was published on April 6, 1932. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 65 years old. It was her first published book, and the world the book presented to its readers was not entirely the world that had existed. Here is what Rose Wilder Lane did in the editing of that earliest manuscript, and why it matters to the story of the Broken Brothers. When Rose reviewed the first version of Little House in the Big Woods in 1930, she made a series of editorial decisions that shaped not just the tone of that one book, but the entire emotional architecture of the series that followed. She eliminated all instances of conflict between Mary and Laura, every moment where the sisters fought, argued, or competed with the specific friction of real siblings living in a small house. Gone. The Pioneer Girl Project's scholarly examination of the manuscript makes this explicit. Lane cut the friction. She smoothed the surfaces. Why? Because Rose Wilder Lane understood with the professional instincts of a working writer who had been selling stories for a decade what a children's book series needed to sustain itself. Warmth. Safety. The sense that the world inside the pages, however hard and cold and hungry, was ultimately a place of love. Conflict between sisters disrupted that safety. So it went. Laura reinstated some of it, and the tension between Mary and Laura ultimately became one of the series' most beloved elements. But the editorial impulse that first removed it, the impulse towards smoothness, toward the version of the past that could be loved most easily, that impulse governed a great deal of what went into the published books and what stayed out. James's illness stayed out. Hiram's service stayed largely out. The full weight of what the war had cost the family stayed out, and what stayed in was a dance at Grandpa's, a bugle, a blue coat with brass buttons, and a story about a boy who ran away to be a drummer boy at 14. Now, before we go any further, because this is the part where, if you have loved these books your entire life, you may be feeling something complicated. I want to be very clear about something. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was not lying. That word, lying, is too simple, too cold, and too small for what actually happens when human beings turn their own lives into stories. What she was doing was something we all do, and something writers do with more deliberateness than most, but not always with more consciousness. She was selecting, she was shaping, she was taking the enormous, unwieldy, contradictory mass of real family experience and finding within it the line of the story she could actually tell. Every memoirist does this. Every person who has ever sat down with a grandchild or a niece or a nephew and said, "Let me tell you about when I was young," does this. You don't tell the whole truth. Not because you are dishonest, but because the whole truth is not a story. It is a warehouse. You pick the things that matter, the things that carry meaning, the things that will make the person across from you feel something useful, and you hand those things over, and you let the rest sit in the dark where it belongs. What makes Laura's case unusual is not that she selected. It is the scale at which that selection travelled. When you tell your grandchildren the story you chose, it stays in your family. When Laura Ingalls Wilder told her family's story, it travelled into more than 60 million homes. It shaped how generations of American children understood the frontier, understood pioneer life, understood what the 19th century felt like from the inside. The selection she made, George with the bugle, James quietly absent, and Hiram invisible, Pa warmly musical and uncomplicated, became, for a very large portion of the American reading public, the truth. That is not a small thing. The year was 1932. Laura was 65. The Great Depression was 3 years deep into its grinding work of reducing the American economy to something that barely functioned. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Banks had failed. Farms had failed. The particular world Laura was writing about, the self-reliant pioneer family, the father who could provide, the land that yielded enough with sufficient labour and sufficient love, was, in 1932, almost an act of political courage. It was a story that said, people can endure, families can hold, the land will provide if you work it honestly and love each other without condition. That message, in the winter of the Great Depression, was not nostalgic escapism, it was medicine. Harper Brothers understood this immediately. Their editors saw what Laura had produced and recognised it for what it was, a book that could give Depression-era readers something they desperately needed. Not solutions, not economics, something older and more fundamental. The feeling that the world had been hard before, and people had survived it. And here is how, and here is what it looked like, and here is the fiddle music that played in the darkness at the edge of the big woods while the family was safe and warm inside. This is the context in which all of the editorial decisions about the book need to be understood, including the ones about the brothers. Laura was not trying to hide James's illness or erase Hiram's service because she was ashamed of them or indifferent to them. She was writing a book for children in 1932 for a publisher whose entire editorial framework was built around warmth and continuity and the reassurance that the world held. There was no place in that framework for the thin veteran in the corner who called himself Pretty Tame. There was no mechanism in a children's series published during the Depression for the honest accounting of what the Civil War had actually cost ordinary northern families in the slow, invisible currency of ruined health and erased years. So it didn't go in. And George's story, the wild bugle player, the former drummer boy, the man whose recklessness had a tidy and heroic explanation, went in instead. Because it could. Because it fit. Because it was the right shape for the space available. But here is the scene I want to walk you through now, the one that actually made it into the book. Chapter 11 of Little House in the Big Woods is titled Harvest. It is a chapter about the rhythm of autumn farm work, the trading of labour between neighbouring families, the communal effort of bringing in the grain before the weather turned. Pa and his neighbour Uncle Henry trade working days. Henry comes to help Pa, then Pa goes to help Henry. The women and children come along, and the adults work while the children are supposed to keep themselves occupied and critically stay out of trouble. One of those children is Charlie. Charlie is a cousin, the son of Uncle Henry and Aunt Polly, and from the moment he appears in the chapter, the text telegraphs what kind of chapter this is going to be. He is the child who will not listen, the one who keeps disrupting the work with false alarms, running to the adults claiming he's been hurt or threatened when in fact he is not. He does it once. He does it twice. He does it repeatedly, crying wolf with such persistence and such detail that by the time the men are deep into the exhausting physical labour of cutting grain in the late summer heat, they have simply stopped believing him. And then Charlie steps on a yellow jacket nest. The real attack comes when everyone has stopped watching for it. He is covered. His clothes are full of them, the sting swelling up across every inch of exposed skin, his fingers stiff, his face puffed and white-dented. The adults come running, strip his clothes, kill the yellow jacket still trapped against his skin, plaster him with mud from the garden. He survives. And Pa, at the end of the scene, delivers a verdict. It served the little liar right. 5 words from Charles Ingalls, and they have been making readers uncomfortable for 90 years, because it is harsh. It is the kind of thing a 21st century parent reading aloud to a 7-year-old tends to either skip over or soften on the fly. But it is also, in the moral world of this particular book, completely consistent. The chapter is about consequences. It is about the cost of dishonesty, dramatised in the most visceral way possible. A child's swollen, stinging body as the direct result of a series of lies. What is remarkable about the Charlie scene, from the perspective of what we're exploring tonight, is not what it says. It is what it demonstrates about Laura's method. Because the Yellow Jacket scene is based on a real event. The Pioneer Girl project confirms it. Charlie was a real cousin, the child of real relatives, and the harvest scene has enough specific sensory detail to make it clear that Laura was working from a genuine memory, possibly one told to her by her parents since she was only a small child in 1870, not old enough to have been present herself. She did not invent it. She verified it against what she knew, gave it the specific colour of real experience and trusted it. That is how she worked, at her best. That is the method that makes the Little House books feel true, even when they are not, strictly speaking, accurate. She was faithful to the emotional core of what happened, to the texture of lived experience, down to the way light fell and bread smelled and cold felt, even when she was rearranging the facts around those sensory anchors. The Charlie scene works because it is true in the way that only real memory can be true. The wrong facts, maybe, but the right feeling, absolutely. Now hold that thought. Hold the image of Charlie covered in Yellow Jacket stings, mud-plastered on a hot late summer afternoon in Wisconsin, the adults exhausted from the harvest and Pa's voice quiet but firm. Hold it next to the dance scene, the bugle, George in the blue coat. Both scenes are from the same book. Both claim the same origin, Laura's real memories of her real childhood, shaped by the stories her parents told around real fires on real Wisconsin winter evenings. And one is almost certainly rooted in genuine family experience, the Charlie scene, with its particular cruelty and its specific sensory detail and its uncomfortable moral. The other, the drummer boy story, is almost certainly a myth. A story the family told because it felt true, because it explained something, because it fit the emotional need of a post-war family trying to make sense of wildness and damage and the specific way the war had rearranged the men they loved. And Laura took both of them and put them on the page with equal confidence, equal warmth, equal authority, which is either the achievement of a masterful storyteller or the problem with a masterful storyteller, depending entirely on where you are standing when you look at it. There is a question running underneath all of this that we have been circling without quite naming yet, and I think it is time to name it. The question is, what did Laura know? Not in 1932 when she wrote the books, not in the finished published text, but earlier, in childhood, in the actual lived experience of growing up in and around the Ingalls family. Did Laura know that James had been the one who served? Did she know that George had not? Did she know about the chronic illness, the pretty tame remark, the gap between the soldier in the story and the soldier in the records? We cannot answer that question with certainty. No document survives that shows us Laura as a child being told the truth and choosing to remember something different. But there are a few things the scholarship gives us that point toward an answer. The manuscript fragment with James's pretty tame line, the one that did not make the published book, tells us that the real James was present in Laura's early drafts. He existed, in some version of the story, as a figure distinct from George. She knew he was there. She knew he had served. She knew he was tame where George was wild. She had the contrast in her hands, and she set it down. Whether she did that consciously or whether the editorial process, her own instincts, Rose's pen, Harper's framework, did it for her, we cannot know. But the contrast existed, and the choice to dissolve it, to give all the war story energy to George and leave James as a footnote. Yes, he was a choice that someone made in the process of turning Pioneer Girl into Little House in the Big Woods. That someone may have been Laura. It may have been Rose. It may have been the particular invisible pressure of writing for children in 1932 about things that happened in 1865. It may have been all three at once, working together the way most editorial decisions work, not through a single deliberate act, but through the accumulated weight of smaller choices, each one reasonable in isolation, each one pushing in the same direction until the final text is far from where the first draft started, and no one can quite say at which step the distance opened up. What we can say with confidence is this. By the time Little House in the Big Woods reached the hands of its first readers in April of 1932, a James Ingalls had been largely erased. Hiram Ingalls was invisible. The Civil War's real cost to the real family had been compressed into a single charming anecdote about a bugle-playing non-veteran in a worn blue coat. And 60 years of readers loved it. Here is what I want you to think about as we move deeper into this story. You know someone like Laura. You may be someone like Laura. You know the feeling of sitting across from a child who's looking at you with full, open, trusting attention and having in your hands two versions of a story. The one that is true in the way that archives are true, dates and facts and the specific ugliness of what things actually cost. And the one that is true in the way that love is true, which is to say incomplete and partial and shaped by the need to protect the person, listening from a weight they are not yet old enough to carry. You know which one you choose. Every person who has ever been the keeper of a family's history has made that choice. And most of us make it the way Laura made it. Quietly, automatically, without drama. Because the choice feels obvious in the moment, and it is only decades later that someone sitting in an archive with a muster roll in their hands will be able to see what it cost. The question this story keeps circling back to is not whether Laura should have told the harder truth. The question is what we do now with the truth she did not tell. That is what the scholars did, starting in the 1970s and continuing with gathering speed into our own time. That is what the Pioneer Girl Project did. That is what Caroline Fraser did in Prairie Fires, her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography published in 2017, and what Pamela Smith Hill did in her annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, and what dozens of archivists and genealogists and careful readers have done in the years since the Little House books became fixed points in the American cultural sky. They went looking for James. They went looking for Hiram. They found them. And what they found when they put the records beside the books is what we are spending tonight with. Not a scandal, not a fraud, not a reason to throw the books away. A family, a war, a woman who wrote the version she could live with. And the other version, the one she could not, waiting in the archives for someone to come and find it. We are that someone tonight. Stay with me. Because the next part of this story takes us somewhere the books never go, into the actual post-war world of James and Hiram, into the particular difficulty of being a Civil War veteran in a country that had already moved on by the time you got home, and into a moment that happened in the 1870s in Wisconsin, in a small house that smelled of wood smoke and winter, when a little girl asked an uncle the wrong question and he gave her the truest answer anyone in this story ever spoke. The question of what a country owes the men it sends to war is not a new question. It is not even a particularly interesting question, in the sense that almost every civilization that has ever organized itself enough to field an army has eventually had to face it, and the answer has almost always been the same. Less than what was taken is delivered later than it was needed, with conditions attached that made it harder to receive than it was worth. The Union Army demobilized approximately 1 million men in the summer and autumn of 1865. 1 million men who had been soldiers were told in the space of a few months to become civilians again, to pick up the tools they had put down, the ploughs and the hammers and the fishing lines and the counting ledgers, and simply resume. The economy expected it. The farms expected it. The wives and children and aging parents who'd been managing without them for 3 or 4 years expected it. The country, having survived the war, wanted very badly to believe that surviving was the same as healing, and that the men who came home were the same men who had left, and that the great national wound could close now, and that the next chapter could begin. The men themselves knew better, but they did not have a language for what they knew. James Ingalls came home to a country that had, in the years he was away, built the beginning of a system to help men like him. The word beginning is doing heavy lifting in that sentence, and it needs to. The Pension Act of 1862, the General Law as it was called, had established, at least in principle, the right of Union veterans to claim compensation for disabilities acquired in service, not just battlefield wounds. The law specifically included disease contracted while in the line of duty. It was, in its way, a recognition that the bodies of the men who served the Union belonged to the Union in a meaningful sense, and that the Union therefore owed those bodies something. The reality of claiming a pension under that law was somewhat different from the principle. A veteran seeking compensation for a service-connected disability had to appear before a local pension surgeon, a community physician appointed to examine claimants and demonstrate to that physician's satisfaction that the condition he was presenting was both genuine and related to his military service. He had to produce witnesses who could corroborate his service. He had to navigate paperwork. He had to wait, sometimes for years, while the Pension Bureau processed his claim in Washington. And then, every 2 years, he had to appear for re-examination to confirm that the disability had not improved. The condition that James carried home from Chattanooga, chronic diarrhea, the persistent gut damage from contaminated water and inadequate food in a Tennessee garrison, was real, documented, and exactly the kind of service-connected illness the general law was designed to address. Whether James applied for a pension, whether he went through the examination process, whether he was approved and what that meant for his daily life, those specific details do not appear with clarity in the records that have survived. What does appear, across the scholarship on the Ingalls family and in the medical and pension literature of the era, is a pattern so consistent it becomes its own kind of answer. Men like James, men who came home carrying invisible damage rather than visible wounds, and even men whose suffering showed in pallor and weakness rather than in missing limbs or legible scars, were systematically disadvantaged by every system the country had built to address what the war had done. The pension system believed visible wounds more readily than invisible illness. The community believed dramatic sacrifice more readily than slow deterioration. The culture of the post-war American frontier, which was not sentimental about weakness and could not afford to be, believed in men who got back to work regardless of what they were carrying. And so, men like James got back to work. Or they tried to. Here is something the Civil War scholarship of the past 30 years has made impossible to ignore, and that the popular mythology of the war has done its best to paper over. There's 87 men in the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery died during the regiment's service. Not in battle. The regiment never fought a battle. They were garrison troops at Chattanooga, guarding forts and heavy guns against a Confederate counterattack that never came, and in all their months in Tennessee they never fired their weapons in anger. 87 men died anyway. Every single one of them died of disease. Think about what that means for a moment. A regiment of men who were never in combat lost nearly a company's worth of soldiers to illness in a single year. To the typhoid and dysentery and malaria that lived in the water supply of a 19th century military camp. To the infections that moved through overcrowded barracks with the quiet efficiency of things that do not need a war to kill you. To the slow-killing work of bad food and wet ground and inadequate shelter, and a medical corps that did not yet understand that the germs in the drinking water were killing more soldiers than Confederate rifles. James Ingalls was present for all of it. He was there for every death. He watched 87 of his regiment die of the same contaminated environment that permanently damaged his own digestive system. He slept in the same barracks. He drank from the same water supply. He breathed the same air over the forts of Chattanooga through the spring and summer and autumn of 1865, while the war ended around them and the country began its celebration, and the men who had guarded the heavy guns in Tennessee waited to be told they could go home. He was lucky, in the cold arithmetic of that situation, to have survived at all. He came home carrying what he carried, and that was the price of his luck. There is a term the Union Army doctors used during the war for a condition they did not fully understand and could not adequately treat. They called it nostalgia. The word sounds almost whimsical now. It sounds like the kind of thing someone feels when they hear a song from their childhood, or smell something that takes them back to a summer they cannot quite reach anymore. But nostalgia, in the medical language of the 1860s, was not a feeling. It was a diagnosis. And it was, for the duration of the war, the second most common medical diagnosis made by Union Army physicians. Nostalgia meant a man whose mind and body had been broken by what he had seen and endured, who had become listless and hollow and unable to function, who could not eat, could not sleep, could not work, could not remember why he was supposed to care about any of the things he used to care about. It was homesickness elevated to a medical catastrophe. It was grief for everything the army had taken. Time, youth, certainty, the specific feeling of safety that only exists before you have seen the world prove it wrong. The symptoms overlapped with what we would today call severe depression, or PTSD, or both. The Union Army's recommended treatment for nostalgia was not rest and compassionate care. It was drilling. Drill the nostalgic soldier harder. Shame him into his senses. Or better yet, and this is quoted directly from the medical literature of the era, expose him to the excitement of an active campaign. In other words, if a man's mind had been broken by the war, the prescribed remedy was more war. This tells you everything you need to know about how the 19th century understood what the army did to the men inside it. The soldiers who came home were not met with language for what had happened to them. They were met with expectation. Get back to work. Get back to the plough. Get back to being the man your family needs, the man your community needs, the man the country is already calling a hero so that it does not have to call him a casualty. James Ingalls fit into this world in the way that a broken gear fits into a machine that hasn't slowed down to notice. The farm didn't know he was sick. The seasons didn't accommodate his pain. The economic reality of the post-war frontier, where survival was still, as it had always been, as directly proportional to the amount of physical labour a family could produce, had no mechanism for honouring what he had sacrificed. There was no word for what it cost him. There was no ceremony for it. There was only the daily quiet difficulty of a man who had given his body to his country and gotten it back in worse condition than it left. Now here is where we have to talk about something that the popular memory of the Civil War almost always skips, and that matters enormously to this story. The veterans who suffered most invisibly from their service were also the men whose sacrifice was least legible to the culture around them. The men who had been in the famous battles, Gettysburg, Antietam, Cold Harbor, had stories. The culture wanted those stories. Veterans organizations celebrated them. Memorial Day was built around them. The mythology of the lost cause and the mythology of Union heroism both centered the dramatic, the violent, the visible. James and Hiram were in none of those stories. They were garrison soldiers, late war volunteers who had spent their service guarding forts in a city that the enemy never actually attacked. Their service was, in the cultural hierarchy of Civil War memory, as low status as it was possible to be and still have served at all. They were not drummer boys. They were not cavalry. They were not the men at Little Round Top or in the wilderness. They were two brothers from Wisconsin who had gone to Tennessee in the last winter of the war and done unglamorous, necessary grinding work that contributed to the Union victory the way all unglamorous, necessary grinding work contributes, invisibly, without recognition, as infrastructure rather than drama. And when the veterans' organizations formed in the 1870s and 1880s, the Grand Army of the Republic, with its membership rolls and its political influence, and its increasingly mythologized vision of what the war had been, the men who got elevated were the men with the most dramatic stories, the men who had been in the famous places on the famous days, men like James, whose story was a year in Chattanooga and a chronic digestive illness that never went away, were present at the meetings but not at the centre of the mythology. Their service was real. Their sacrifice was real. But the culture had already decided which kind of sacrifice it wanted to celebrate, and it was not theirs. And Hiram. We have been following Hiram at a slight distance so far, for the same reason the historical record keeps him at a slight distance. The documentation of his post-war life is thinner than James's, and responsible history does not invent where it cannot confirm. But what we know about Hiram is this: he came home at 17 and he built a life. The Pioneer Girl Project's work on the Ingalls family confirms that Hiram lived into adulthood without the chronic physical illness that defined his older brother's post-war years. He did not carry the same visible damage in his body. What he carried instead was something harder to document. He had been 16 when he enlisted, 16 when he crossed Lake Pepin and lied about his age to a recruiter who needed bodies and did not look too carefully at the ones he was offered. He had spent a year in a garrison camp in Tennessee watching men die of disease, watching a war end that he had arrived too late to fight, doing the work of soldiering without any of the story the culture attached to soldiering, And then he was 17, and it was over, and he went home. The specific psychological weight of that, of being a boy who spent his 16th year in a place that boys should not have to be, and who came home to a family that had its own grief and its own adjustments to make, with no ceremony and no recognition, and no language for what any of it had meant. That weight does not appear in any record. It simply happened to him, the way things happen to people who are too young and too invisible to leave much trace. He grew up, he got on with it, the way people do, and his name never made the book. In the 1880s and 1890s, the veterans' pension rolls swelled, and the Grand Army of the Republic became a political force. In 1890, Congress passed the Disability Pension Act, dramatically broadening eligibility to include disabilities not necessarily connected to wartime service. Veterans who had served at least 90 days and were unable to perform manual labour became eligible regardless of how or when their disability occurred. The pensions range from $6 to $12 per month, not enough to live on, but enough in the arithmetic of a frontier household to matter. This is the world James Ingalls was navigating in the years when his niece Laura was growing up and absorbing the family's stories, a world where his service was theoretically entitled to recognition, a world where the machinery of veteran support existed, however imperfectly, a world where his name was in the muster roll, his presence on every Company E roll call was documented, his chronic illness was a matter of record. And yet, somewhere in that world, as Laura was growing up, his story was being quietly replaced by the story of the brother who had not served at all. Not maliciously, not through any single deliberate act, just through the ordinary human preference for the story that can be told without stopping the music. This is the part of the story where I want to ask you to do something uncomfortable. I want you to think about the women, not Laura specifically. We will get to Laura in the chapters ahead, but the women of the Ingalls and Quiner families in the years immediately after the war. The mothers and sisters and wives and daughters who did not go to war, and who did not come home from it either, and who were nonetheless living daily inside its consequences. Caroline Ingalls, Ma, had lost her brother Joseph Quiner at 26. She had watched Charles's two younger brothers leave for Tennessee and come back changed. She had a husband who had not served, a fact that carried its own complicated texture in a community where military service had been the defining moral event of the decade. She had a household to run, children to raise, a farm that did not stop requiring labour, because the men in her family were sorting through the aftermath of things she'd not been there for and could only understand from the outside. What did Caroline Ingalls think about the war? What did she think when she looked at James, thin, pale, gut-sick, calling himself pretty tame, and then looked at Charles, her husband, who had been here the whole time? What did she think when George played the bugle, and everyone laughed, and the family story smoothed itself out into something that could be handed down without too much pain? We do not know. Caroline Ingalls left almost nothing in writing. A few letters, a handful of fragments, and what she left gives us the surface of a woman who was capable and steady and privately complex in ways the public record cannot reach. But she was there. She was watching. She was making sense of it in whatever way the women of her time made sense of the things that happened to the men around them, which was usually by putting those things into the category of what could not be changed, and getting on with the category of what could. She could not change what James carried in his body. She could not change what Charles had not done. She could not change what the war had cost the family in grief and health, and the particular invisible currency of years. What she could do was raise her daughters, Mary, Laura, Carrie, in a home where Pa played the fiddle, and the family was warm, and the stories that got told by firelight were the ones that could be held without breaking something, and she did that. And Laura grew up breathing the version of the family the adults had constructed around her, and she loved it completely, and she put it in a book. But here is what the records give us that the book does not. The 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery was not an anomaly. It was a representative sample of what American military service in 1865 actually looked like for the thousands of men who were not in the celebrated regiments, not at the famous battles, not part of the story the country was already building about what the war had meant. There were hundreds of regiments like it. There were tens of thousands of men like James, men who had gone south and done necessary work and come home carrying damage that no monument would ever commemorate, because the damage was in their stomachs and their lungs and their nerves and the part of their minds that used to sleep without flinching and now didn't anymore. Men whose sacrifice was real and whose invisibility was also real, because the country that had needed them did not, in the end, need the full truth of what it had cost them. What the country needed was the mythology, the drummer boy, the bugle, the brass buttons catching the candlelight at a country dance, and so that is what it got. I want to leave you in a specific place before we move to the next part of this story. I want to leave you in Wisconsin, in the early 1870s, in a house that smells of wood smoke and pine resin, and the particular cold that sits in the air of the northern Midwest from October through April, as if it has nowhere else to be. In that house there is a family. There is Pa, who is warm and musical and present in the way that men who do not carry visible damage are able to be present. There is Ma, steady and private and managing the 1,000 silent calculations that keep a household alive. Yeah, there are the girls, Mary and Laura and little Carrie, growing up inside the stories their parents are telling and not telling, breathing the air of a family that has survived something without being entirely able to say what. And there is, somewhere at the edges of that world, a thin man. He is not in every scene. He does not play the fiddle. He does not dance. He is James, or someone very much like what James had become by then. And he is carrying something in his body that does not have a name in this house, and perhaps in no house on the frontier. A little girl named Laura looked at him once and asked him a question. He told her he was pretty tame. She was going to spend 60 years deciding what to do with that answer. She was born on February 7th, 1867, 2 years after the war ended, 2 years after Hiram and James came home from Chattanooga, after the last flag of the Confederacy was furled, after the country had begun its long, loud, complicated argument about what to do with the peace it had bought at such enormous cost. Laura Ingalls came into a world that was already in the middle of forgetting, not on purpose, not through cruelty, but forgetting is what the living do with the things that the dead and the damaged have left behind, and the America of 1867 was doing it at a remarkable pace. The war had been 4 years of sustained national collective trauma, and the people who had survived it were not waiting for scholars to help them process what it had meant. They were ploughing fields, they were building houses, they were doing the 1,000 necessary things that life demands whether or not you are ready for it. And the war was becoming the thing you talked about at the GAR meetings and the reunions, not the thing you carried in your body every day. Except for James. James carried it in his body every day. But Laura did not know that yet. She was 2 years old. She was 4 years old. She was a small girl with dark hair and quick eyes, who lived in a little log house near Pepin, Wisconsin, in the big woods that she would one day make the most famous forest in American children's literature. The year the books are set, the year of the dance, the bugle, the Charlie scene, the long winter evenings of fiddle music, is 1871. Laura was 4 years old. This is a fact worth holding for a moment because it changes the geometry of everything we have been building toward tonight. The events of Little House in the Big Woods, the family life, the uncles, the dance, the stories Pa told. Laura experienced them when she was a small child who could barely reach the table. She was not observing them with a writer's eye. She was not cataloguing them with a historian's precision. She was 4 years old, absorbing the world in the total, immersive, uncritical way that 4-year-olds absorb the world, taking in the warmth and the music and the firelight, and the particular safe feeling of being inside while the Wisconsin winter pressed against the walls outside. That is the clay from which the books were eventually shaped. Not adult memory, not careful reconstruction. The filtered, distilled, emotionally preserved impressions of a child who was too young to understand most of what she was watching, held inside the mind of a woman who spent 6 decades carrying them before she finally wrote them down. The family left Wisconsin in October of 1873. Laura was 6. Charles had sold his Pepin land. Not a small sum for a family that had been farming and moving and farming again for years with no end to the moving in sight. And the Ingalls were heading west. West was always the direction. West was where the land was still cheap, where the horizon still held promise, where a man who was, as Laura would eventually describe him, jolly but inclined to be reckless, could start again on ground that hadn't yet had a chance to disappoint him. They would spend years in Minnesota, in Kansas, in Dakota Territory. They would face blizzards and crop failures and the particular grinding poverty that follows a family that moves before it has time to put down enough roots to hold. The big woods of Wisconsin, the fiddle music, the extended family within visiting distance, the dances at Grandpa's, would slowly recede into the category of the past. The specific warmth of that world, the feeling of being close to kin in a cold country, would become something Laura carried forward in memory, long after the geography that had held it was gone. But before they left, something happened that most readers of the Little House books never knew about. Something that was taken out of the story before it ever had a chance to be put in. In November of 1875, Caroline Ingalls gave birth to a son. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. The family called him Freddie. He was the only son among 4 daughters, and he was never a healthy baby. Laura wrote in Pioneer Girl that Freddie had suffered convulsions from early in his life, that there was something in him that the country air and the family love and the frontier medicine of 1876 could not fix. He died on August 27, 1876, while the family was visiting Uncle Peter's farm in Wabasha County, Minnesota. He was 9 months old. The county death record, preserved in Wabasha County's Book A, lists the cause of death as diarrhea. The same word that follows James through the pension records. The same disease, or something running under the same name, that umbrella term the 19th century used for the various infections and inflammations that destroyed intestines and stole lives from the very old and the very young with equal indifference. The same word. James had survived it at 21 in a garrison camp in Tennessee. Freddie did not survive it at 9 months in a small house in Minnesota. The family buried him. Freddie was buried somewhere on or near Peter Ingalls' farm. The exact location has never been confirmed, and then they moved again, the way they always moved. Not away from the grief, exactly, but alongside it, carrying it west the way they carried everything else that could not be left behind. Caroline Ingalls said, late in her own life, when she was an old woman who had outlived most of the people she had loved, everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. 6 words, not a speech, not a breakdown. 6 words, quietly spoken into the particular silence of a woman who had been carrying a question for 50 years and had simply, finally, let it out. Yes, Freddie is not in the Little House books, not a word. The child who died of the same disease that broke his uncle, the disease that moved through the garrison at Chattanooga and the frontier households of Minnesota with the same invisible efficiency, is entirely absent from the books that Laura built from her childhood. And you have to ask yourself, is that a coincidence? It is not a coincidence. When you look at the full architecture of what Laura left out of the Little House series, not just Freddie, not just James's illness, not just Hiram's service, but the full inventory of what was real and what was omitted, a pattern emerges that is too consistent to be accidental. She left out death. She left out the specific, unglamorous, though utterly routine death that frontier life dealt to children, to veterans, to anyone who drank the wrong water or breathed the wrong air, or simply did not have access to the medicine that might have saved them. She left out the version of the 19th century where disease killed more people than anything else, where a baby's diarrhea and a veteran's chronic gut damage and a regiment's 87 dead in Tennessee were all manifestations of the same fundamental fact about that world, that it was full of invisible things that killed you quietly, without the dignity of a battlefield wound, without the story that a battlefield wound could carry. She left all of that out, and she put in the fiddle music. And here is what the scholars who have done the most careful work on Wilder, Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires, and Pamela Smith Hill in her annotated Pioneer Girl, the researchers at the Pioneer Girl Project, Here is what all of them eventually arrive at, coming from different angles, using different evidence, speaking in different registers. They do not condemn her for it. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder's real life was harder than the books, significantly harder. Fraser's description of that life, relentless struggle, rootlessness, poverty, is not an exaggeration. This was a woman who had worked for near-nothing wages from about the age of 10 to help keep the family solvent, who had watched a sister go blind and survived crop failures and blizzards, and the long winter when the family ground seed wheat in a coffee mill because there was nothing else to eat. She knew exactly how dark the world could be. She made the books warm anyway. That was not a failure of honesty. That was an act of love, a decision, conscious or not, to give her readers the version of the past that could sustain them, the one where family holds, where pa's fiddle wins against the cold, where even the hardest years have enough warmth in them to keep a child safe inside the story. The question we have been building toward all night is not whether that love was real. It was. It absolutely was. The question is, what does it cost when the version of the past that can sustain us is built on the invisibility of the people who couldn't be made to fit? Now I want to take you somewhere very specific. A room, Wisconsin, sometime in the early 1870s, when the extended Ingalls family was still close enough to gather for the dances and the harvests, and the long communal winter evenings that Laura would spend the rest of her life trying to reconstruct on paper. There is a little girl in this room. She's somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, and she is watching the adults the way small children watch adults, with total, unguarded, absorptive attention, the kind that does not know it is memorizing because it does not know yet that memory is something that can be used. She has been watching Uncle George. George is the one everyone watches. He is the one who takes up space in a room. He is the one with the too loud laugh and the restlessness that doesn't quite settle even when he sits down, and the stories that are always slightly larger than the facts that contain them. He is, and this word follows him through the family accounts with the persistence of a label that has found its man, wild. And now the little girl is watching Uncle James. James is quieter. James is thinner. James is the one who sits in the corner and smiles at the right moments, and contributes to the conversation without driving it. James is... What is the word for James? The family doesn't seem to have settled on one. George has his word. James has his absence of word, which is its own kind of description. And the little girl, because small children ask the things that adults have learned not to ask, turns to Uncle James and puts the question to him. Are you wild too? Or something like that. The exact phrasing is lost. What survives? In the manuscript fragment that scholars have found preserved in the early drafts of Little House in the Big Woods is James's answer. Pretty tame, not defensive, not bitter, not the answer of a man who is angry about what the war cost him, or what his brother George has been made into, or what his own service has and has not been given. Just pretty tame. A small, quiet, self-deprecating sentence from a man who went to war at 21 and came home with a sick body and a modest self-assessment and apparently not a great deal of interest in being dramatised. That answer tells you everything about who James Ingalls was, and the fact that it did not make the book tells you everything about the book. Think about what Laura was holding as a child in the years after that exchange. She had, in her family, a man whose wildness had a story, a war story, a dramatic story, a story with a bugle and a blue coat and brass buttons that caught the light. And she had another man whose service had no story, or at least no story anyone seemed to want to tell. A man who was pretty tame, a man whose body was the record of what the war had done to him, but whose body was not a story that could be carried forward in the way that the bugle could. She held both of those men in her memory for 60 years. She chose George. Now, and this is the part I want you to really sit with, was that choice wrong? I do not think it was wrong in the way that a lie is wrong. I think it was a choice shaped by forces that were larger than Laura and older than Laura, and that had been operating on the American memory of the Civil War since the moment the guns went quiet in April of 1865. The culture had already decided that the war's meaning lived in its drama. It lived in the charge and the flag and the drummer boy. Not in the chronic diarrhea, not in the pension examination every 2 years, not in the 87 men who died of disease in a garrison they never had to fight their way out of, not in the man who came home and said he was pretty tame and meant it in a way that was both funny and heartbreaking and completely, unmistakably true. Laura absorbed that cultural decision the way all of us absorb the cultural decisions that precede us, not through argument, not through debate, but through the simple fact of growing up inside them. The air she breathed was the air of a country that wanted the drummer boy. And so when she sat down at 63 with a cheap school tablet and began reconstructing her family, the drummer boy was there waiting, already shaped, already named, already wearing his blue coat with the brass buttons. And James was pretty tame, so James stepped back. But here is what I want you to understand about the manuscript fragment, because it changes the story in a way that the published book cannot. The fact that James's line made it into an early draft at all means that Laura knew. She knew the contrast existed. She held both versions in her hands. She wrote the tame veteran down, the self-deprecating uncle, the man whose actual service was there in the early pages of what would become the book, and then, at some point in the process that turned Pioneer Girl into Little House in the Big Woods, that line was set aside. We do not know whether it was Laura's hand or Rose's that set it aside. We do not know whether Harper's editorial sensibility played a role. We do not know whether it was a conscious choice, or simply the kind of editorial gravity that pulls stories toward their most usable shape. What we know is that the line existed, and it was true, and it was real, and it didn't make the book. In the years between Laura's birth in 1867 and the family's departure from Wisconsin in 1873, she grew up in a world of extended family. Not the idealized frontier family of a children's book, just Pa, Ma, the girls, and the big woods, but an actual dense kinship network in which cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents were frequently present, frequently visiting, frequently part of the daily landscape. Uncle Henry and Aunt Polly lived nearby. Henry was Caroline's brother and Polly was Charles's sister, which means these two families were connected twice over, through two separate sibling relationships, the kind of double-knot family bond that creates the particular closeness of people who are related to each other in more than one direction. Uncle Peter and his family were there too. Pa's brother, married to Ma's sister. Another double connection. Another layer of the kin network that made Wisconsin feel, in those years, like the world had edges you could trust. James and Hiram were somewhere in that world. Not always in the same house, not always at the same table, but present. Part of the landscape Laura was absorbing in the wordless total way of early childhood. She was breathing the full version of the family, and then she was 6, and they left, and the full version started becoming a memory, and then the memory started becoming a story, and then the story started becoming something that could be written down. And what could be written down was not the full version. It was the warm one. By the time Laura sat down in the late 1920s to write Pioneer Girl, almost everything she was writing about had happened 50 or more years before. She was not working from diaries. She was not working from contemporary accounts. She was working from the particular kind of memory that survives 6 decades, not precise, not complete, but emotionally true in the way that the things you absorbed as a small child are always emotionally true. She remembered the feeling of the dance. She remembered the sound of the bugle. She remembered Uncle George's wildness as a quality in the room, a presence, something you could feel. She remembered Uncle James as quiet and pale and tame. She remembered that Pa had explained George's wildness with the drummer boy story. And she had been 4 or 5 or 6, and she had believed it the way small children believe the explanations their parents give them, completely and without complication. The drummer boy story was probably Pa's story first. Not Laura's, not Rose's, not Harper's. Charles Ingalls, jolly, musical, reckless. The man who had stayed home while his brothers went south is the most likely origin point for the myth. He is the one who would have been explaining George's wildness to curious children. He is the one whose narrative of the family needed an account of the war that did not centre his own non-service. He is the one who loved the fiddle and the dance and the stories told by firelight. and he was telling those stories to Laura from the time she could sit up and listen. Pa gave her the drummer boy, and Laura, because she loved Pa with the total devotion of a daughter who had followed him across half the country and watched him face every hardship the frontier could offer and keep playing the fiddle anyway. Laura kept the drummer boy. She kept him for 60 years, and then she put him in the book, and then he became real. Not in the archives, not in the muster rolls, not in the careful, quiet scholarship that would eventually find him out, but in the hearts of tens of millions of readers who grew up believing in a boy who raised a bugle to his lips in a log cabin in the Wisconsin woods, while the candlelight played across the brass buttons of his coat, and the fiddle sang and the snow came down outside, and everything inside was warm and safe and whole. Real in that way, which is its own kind of real, and its own kind of loss. For most of the 20th century, no one went looking. That is the plainest way to say it. For decades after Little House in the Big Woods was published in April of 1932, through the 1940s, through the television era of the 1950s and 1960s, through the cultural explosion of the 1970s when the NBC series turned Laura Ingalls Wilder into a household name with a face. For all of that time, virtually no one picked up the muster rolls. The books were loved. They were assigned in schools across the country. They were read by mothers to daughters, and then by those daughters to their own daughters, generation after generation, that particular chain of the women's reading that is one of the most durable forces in American literary culture. Librarians recommended them. Teachers cited them. Academics wrote about them, but mostly about their literary qualities, their narrative structure, their place in the American children's book canon. Nobody sat down with the military records. Nobody went to the National Archives and asked for Company E. And because nobody asked, the drummer boy story simply continued to be true in the way that all unchallenged stories are true, by the absence of anyone willing to say otherwise. The first serious cracks appeared in the 1970s and 1980s, when a small number of scholars began doing something that felt, at the time, almost transgressive. They compared the books with the facts, not to attack Laura, not to dismantle something beloved, but because the gap between what the books presented and what the historical record showed had become, for careful readers who also happened to be historians, impossible to ignore. Mary Victoria Gash's 1980 thesis at Iowa State University and John E. Miller's biographical work in the 1990s each approached that gap from different angles and arrived at the same finding. The distance between Laura Ingalls Wilder's life and Laura Ingalls Wilder's books was larger than the book's reception had publicly acknowledged. Miller's Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder, published by the University of Missouri Press in 1998, was among the first major scholarly biographies to rigorously cross-reference the novels with primary records. He found the expected discrepancies, rearranged chronologies, compressed characters, softened hardships. But his work also laid the groundwork for the specific question that would not be fully answered till the next decade. What exactly had happened to the Ingalls brothers? The Pioneer Girl Project began in 2009. The South Dakota State Historical Society Press spent that year in negotiations with the Laura Ingalls Wilder estate, working toward the right to annotate and publish the original handwritten manuscript of Pioneer Girl, the adult memoir that had preceded all the books, the raw first draft of Laura's memory that had been submitted to publishers in 1930, declined, and then mined for children's fiction instead. The manuscript had existed all along, of course. It had been sitting in archives. Scholars had known about it. A few had quoted from it. But the full annotated scholarly edition, the one that would put Laura's original words next to the verified historical record, note by careful note, page by careful page, had never been published. It finally came out in 2014. And when readers opened it, what they found was an original document that was, in measurable ways, a different story from the one the children's books had told. Not a completely different story, not a fraudulent one, but one that showed, with the specificity of a handwritten first draft, where the softening had happened, where the dark material had been, what had existed before the editorial gravity of children's publishing in Depression-era America had pulled it toward warmth and continuity, and the version of the past that could be handed down. The Pioneer Girl Project's researchers, working from that manuscript and from the military, census, land and vital records they could cross-reference against it, produced the biographical sketches that finally put the brothers into clear focus. Hiram Ingalls, his birth date, April 27, 1848, confirmed. His enlistment, January 1865, Lake City, Minnesota, Company E, 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery, with his age recorded as 19 when he was 16, confirmed. His discharge at Fort Snelling, September 27, 1865, confirmed. James Ingalls, his birth date, March 14, 1843, confirmed. His enlistment alongside Hiram, confirmed. His presence on every Company E roll call from January through September 1865, confirmed. His chronic diarrhea, the service-connected illness that followed him out of Tennessee and into the rest of his life, confirmed. George Whiting Ingalls, born 1851, married Julia Bard in 1876, no Civil War service record of any kind, confirmed absent. The researchers did not stop at simply noting the absence. They went further, doing the specific genealogical work of identifying other men named George Ingalls in Civil War records and systematically ruling each of them out. Wrong birth year, wrong location, wrong service details. They eliminated every candidate. When they were finished, what remained was a certainty rather than a suspicion. His name was not there because he was not there. And the brother whose name was there, the one who had actually gone, who had actually spent 1865 in a garrison camp in Tennessee, who had come home thin and sick and quietly called himself Pretty Tame, had received almost no presence in the books that made his family famous. 2017 brought something else. Carolyn Fraser had been working on a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder for years, some doing the kind of exhaustive archival research that most biographers describe as the phase of the project that nearly breaks them. The phase where you're reading through boxes of letters and pension applications and newspaper clippings and land records, and you're trying to build a life out of documents that were never intended to be a biography. The book she produced was called Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It was published in November 2017. In March of 2018, it won the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. It also won the National Book Critics Circle Award. It was named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. It was, in short, not an obscure academic volume that drifted quietly through the world of Wilder scholarship without touching the general reading public. And it was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about one of the most beloved authors in American history, and it said in clear and careful and beautifully documented prose that the beloved author's real life had been substantially harder, stranger, and more painful than the books she wrote. Fraser's central insight, the one that reviewers and readers kept returning to, the one that the prize committees recognised, was precisely the one we have been circling all night. That the Little House books were not a window into 19th century America. They were a myth about it, a conscious, loving, carefully crafted myth, built by a woman who had lived through genuine hardship and who chose, with the instincts of a great storyteller, to transform that hardship into something that could sustain rather than crush the people who read it. A profound act of American myth-making and self-transformation. That is how Fraser described what Laura had done. Not a lie, not a fraud, an act, a creative act of the highest order, which happens to be inseparable from a corresponding act of erasure. You cannot build the myth without clearing the ground first, and clearing the ground meant James and Hiram and Freddie, and all the other invisible things that the books contain by their absence. And here is one of the most striking examples Fraser found, one that most readers of the Little House series have carried with them for decades without knowing it was wrong. Mary Ingalls went blind. You know this. Everyone who has read the books or watched the television series knows this. Mary, Laura's older sister, the golden-haired, gentle, studious one, lost her sight as a teenager, and the series presents it as a consequence of scarlet fever. The books say scarlet fever. They have been saying it since Laura first wrote about it in By the Shores of Silver Lake in 1939. Millions of readers have believed it. In 2013, a peer-reviewed study published in the journal Pediatrics, conducted by University of Michigan researchers who used medical records from the 19th century, unpublished family journals and contemporary newspaper accounts, concluded that Mary Ingalls almost certainly did not go blind from scarlet fever. The condition that destroyed her vision in 1879 was almost certainly viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammatory disease attacking the brain and its surrounding tissues, which causes the specific combination of symptoms Mary displayed: fever, facial nerve damage and permanent blindness, in a way that scarlet fever does not. A local newspaper at the time reported that it was feared hemorrhage of the brain had set in, and that one side of Mary's face became partially paralysed. The nerves of her eyes were described as dying. These are not the fingerprints of scarlet fever. They are the fingerprints of meningoencephalitis. Scarlet fever was not incorrect because Laura was careless. It was what the family understood at the time. It was the diagnosis available to a frontier family in 1879. But the books, written in the late 1930s, shaped by a woman reconstructing her childhood from decades-old memory, preserved the family's contemporary understanding of the event, rather than a medical correction that the medicine of that era may not have been able to provide anyway. The point is not that Laura lied about Mary's illness. The point is that the books present themselves with such authoritative warmth, such confident specificity of detail, that generations of readers absorbed their medical, historical and biographical claims as fact. And some of those claims were not accurate in ways that later scholarship has had to carefully, respectfully correct. Mary's blindness, George's service, James's absence, Freddie's non-existence in the pages, the family's degree of isolation versus their actual dense kinship network, the smoothness of a childhood that was, in reality, marked by debt and disease, and the grinding uncertainty of a father who, for all his warmth and music, could not stay in one place long enough to let anything take root. All of it looked different once the archives were opened. And here is the thing about what the archives found that I want you to sit with for a long moment. None of it makes the books worse. That is not a diplomatic concession. That is the honest conclusion of everyone who has done the most serious and sustained work on this material. Miller, Fraser, Hill, the Pioneer Girl Project researchers. None of them end their work with a verdict of condemnation. None of them say, put the books down, they are not worth your time, the myth has been exposed and the artifact is ruined. They say something more complicated and more interesting than that. They say, now that you know what was left out, you can understand what was put in with different eyes. The fiddle music is more beautiful when you know that the man playing it did not go to war, and that his younger brothers did, and that one of them came back thin and sick and called himself Pretty Tame, and that the woman who eventually turned all of this into a story chose to make room for the music and not for the damage. That is a more complicated beauty than the one the books present on their surface. But it is real beauty, and it holds. What the archives also gave back in the years of careful scholarship since the Pioneer Girl Project began is something the myth had completely erased. The specific texture of who the brothers were. Hiram Lemuel Ingalls, born April 27th, 1848. The boy who had grown up watching the war happen to the world around him, and who, at 16, crossed Lake Pepin in January of 1865 and lied about his age with enough conviction to make it stick. Who spent his 16th year in Tennessee and came home at 17 and built a life that the record does not follow as closely as it follows James. But that was real, and was his, and was shaped by things no 17-year-old should have to carry. James Lansford Ingalls, named for the family patriarch Lansford, in the way that middle names carry the weight of who a family is trying to honour, born March 14th, 1843, who went south with his teenage brother and served honestly and came home with a sick gut and a quiet sense of himself that did not require the drama of a drummer boy story, who told a small girl once that he was pretty tame, who was by every measure the record provides exactly what he said he was, steady, undramatic, genuinely brave in the particular way of men who do what is required of them without needing anyone to make it into a story. And George George Whiting Ingalls, born 1851, the youngest brother, who came of age in a post-war world where the war was the defining story of the generation above him, and who somehow, through some combination of personality and circumstance, and the particular human need to explain things that resist explanation, became the man the family attached the story to, not maliciously, not through George's own seeking. The story found him the way family stories find the person they fit best, not the person they are most accurate about, but the person whose life, whose energy, whose quality in a room most easily accommodates the meaning the story needs to carry. George was wild. The war made men wild. The fit was too clean to resist, and so the story lived in George, and James disappeared into his tame quiet, and Hiram disappeared into the general invisibility of the young, and the real history of two men who actually served their country, and paid for it with their bodies weighted in the archives for someone to come and find it. The Pioneer Girl Project found it. Caroline Fraser found it. The scholars who have spent the last 40 years carefully, rigorously, lovingly, dismantling and rebuilding the history behind the myth found it. And now you have found it too. But there is one more layer to what the archives reveal that I want to make sure we do not pass by. It is not just what the archives found about the brothers. It is what the archives found about the relationship between the myth and the people who encountered it. Because the Pioneer Girl Project did not just produce a scholarly edition of a manuscript. It produced something that functioned, once it was published in 2014, as a kind of permission. Permission for readers who had loved the Little House books their entire lives to ask the questions they had maybe half-formed but not fully voiced. Permission to say, I love these books and I want to know what is true about them. Permission to hold both things at once, the love and the scrutiny, without one cancelling the other. What happened after 2014, and especially after Prairie fires in 2017, in the online communities that had formed around Wilder, the Facebook groups, the Reddit threads, the genealogy forums where enthusiasts had been quietly doing their own record searching for years, was remarkable. It was a kind of collective coming to terms, not a rejection, a renegotiation. Readers who had grown up with these books as companions, as comfort objects almost, as the specific literary equivalent of a warm blanket on a winter evening, found themselves sitting with a more complicated version of what they loved. And most of them stayed. Most of them did not put the books down. Most of them said, yes, I understand that this is a myth. Yes, I understand that James existed and George did not serve and Freddie was left out and Mary's illness was misattributed. I understand all of that, and I am going to read to my daughter tonight anyway, because the myth still holds something true that the archives cannot give you. It holds the feeling. It holds the particular warmth of a family by a fire in winter, the fiddle going, the cold outside, the people you love inside the circle of the light. It holds the idea that family can be enough, that love can be practical, that the things you make with your own hands, houses, stories, meals, music, have a value that does not depend on whether anyone ever writes them down. That is not a myth. That part is true. The archives gave us back the real brothers. They gave us Hiram and James and the muster roll and the garrison at Chattanooga and the chronic diarrhea and the 87 dead and the pretty tame. And the books give us something else. They give us the fire. And somewhere between the archives and the fire, somewhere in the space between what the records say and what the music sounds like on a winter night when you are 4 years old, and the candlelight catches the brass buttons on your uncle's coat, somewhere in that space is the actual truth of this story. Not the historian's truth, not the archivist's truth, but the human truth. The truth of how families survive the things that would otherwise undo them. By choosing carefully the version of the story that can be carried forward. By building warmth over damage. By playing the fiddle. Stay with me. We're almost at the end. On the morning of February 10th, 1957, a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri went quiet. Laura Ingalls Wilder had gone to sleep on the night of February 9th, in the same house where she had lived for 61 years. In the bedroom of the farmhouse called Rocky Ridge that she and Almanzo had built with their own hands on a hillside in the Missouri Ozarks in the last decade of the 19th century, She had gone to sleep 3 days after turning 90 years old. She had wanted to reach 90 because Almanzo had reached 92, and she was that kind of woman. The kind who decides what she wants to do and does it, quietly, without announcement. She did not wake up. She was buried next to Almanzo in the Mansfield Cemetery, and the myth she had built continued without her. Here is the first thing I want you to understand about what happened after Laura died. It got bigger. If anything, the absence of the woman who had made the books more powerful, not less. The series moved into that particular cultural territory that only the greatest children's literature occupies. The territory where the author is no longer a person but a presence, where the books are no longer an individual achievement but a shared inheritance, where the question, "Did you read these?" carries the emotional weight of an identity claim rather than a literary inquiry. By the 1970s, when NBC debuted the television series based on the books, what Laura had built was no longer just a set of novels. It was a mythology. A warm, coherent, deeply American mythology about who this country had been and what it had been worth, and how ordinary families had faced impossible conditions and held together by the specific combination of love and stubbornness and music that the books encoded as the pioneer spirit. And millions of American girls grew up with that mythology as part of the furniture of their inner lives. It was there before they could evaluate it. It was there before they had the vocabulary for evaluation. It simply was, the way the things we absorb in childhood simply are. Present in us, shaping us, making us into the people we become before we have any say in the matter, which is exactly what myths are supposed to do, and exactly why the question of what they contain, and what they leave out, and whose absence makes them possible, that question matters in a way that goes beyond literary criticism. Now, here is the thing almost nobody knows. In the drawer of Laura's desk at Rocky Ridge Farm, among the papers that were eventually found after her death, there was a manuscript. Not Pioneer Girl, or it's not the book that eventually became the Little House series. Something else. Something Laura had written about the early years of her marriage to Almanzo, the years the books largely skip, the years after the final novel in the series ends, the years of the homestead claims and the crop failures and the fire that took everything, and the diphtheria that left Almanzo partially paralysed for the rest of his life. The years Laura herself described in private correspondence as the hardest ones, the ones she could never quite bring herself to shape into the kind of story she knew how to tell. The manuscript sat in the drawer. Laura had written it and not sought to publish it. Rose Wilder Lane died on October the 30th, 1968. The manuscript was eventually found by Roger Lee McBride, Laura's literary heir, while going through Rose's estate after her death. It was published in 1971, 14 years after Laura died. It was called The First 4 Years, and if you have read it, you know that it is different from all the other Little House books in a way that is impossible to miss and difficult to fully explain. It is rawer, darker, less shaped, less warm. It reads like a first draft that was never finished, because Laura could never figure out how to make the material do what the other books had taught her to make material do. Resolve, hold, become something that could be carried forward without breaking. The hardship in the first 4 years does not resolve into warmth. It just sits there. Their baby son, born in July of 1889, dead on August 7th, 27 days old, is in the first 4 years. The house fire is in it. Almanzo's illness is in it. The poverty, grinding and specific and relentless, is in it. All the things she knew how to leave out of the other books, she left in this one. Because she never finished it, and because she never published it, which tells you something extraordinary about Laura Ingalls Wilder that the published series alone can never fully show you. She knew exactly what she was doing in the book she did publish. She knew the difference between the story she was telling and the one she was keeping. The manuscript in the drawer is the proof of that knowledge. She had the darker version. She chose, every time, the warmer one except once, and that once stayed in the drawer until she was dead. But here is where the story of the myth takes its most unexpected turn, and I want you to stay with me through this because it is uncomfortable in a way that matters. In 1954, 3 years before Laura died, 1 year after she held the Garth Williams illustrations in her aging hands. The American Library Association created an award for children's literature and named it after her, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. She was given the first bronze medal personally. It was, in the specific language of American cultural honour, the highest thing the children's literature establishment could do to signal that what Laura had built was permanent, valued, woven into the fabric of what American children deserve to inherit. She put the medal in a drawer. That detail comes from the people who knew her. It's documented in the biographies and memoirs and letters that scholars have assembled from the Rocky Ridge years. She put it in a drawer, not out of false modesty, perhaps out of the particular scepticism about ceremony that is common in people who have worked hard enough and long enough that the work itself is the thing, and the medal is just a piece of metal that other people decided meant something. In June of 2018, the Association for Library Service to Children voted unanimously to remove her name from that award. The vote was unanimous. The reason given was that Wilder's body of work includes expressions of what the organisation called, specifically, anti-native and anti-black sentiments that are inconsistent with ALSC's core values of inclusiveness, integrity and respect. The award was renamed the Children's Literature Legacy Award. I want to stay with what that decision represents for a moment because it is not simple. The specific concern at the centre of the debate is not an abstraction. In 1998, 20 years before the ALA vote, 41 years after Laura died, an 8-year-old girl on the Upper Sioux Reservation in southwestern Minnesota came home in tears. Her third-grade teacher had been reading Little House on the Prairie aloud to the class. One of the characters in that book speaks a sentence that was, in the culture of 1870s Kansas, the kind of thing certain white settlers said without particular drama or self-consciousness. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. An 8-year-old girl heard that sentence read aloud by her teacher in a classroom from a book that her school's curriculum had presented as a beloved classic of American children's literature. She came home crying. Her mother requested that the school district remove the book from the curriculum. That is not a debate about literary theory. That is a child. That is a sentence. That is a classroom. And it is the thing that the discussion about Wilder's legacy, the same discussion about myth-making and erasure, and the gap between what we choose to preserve and what we choose to leave out, eventually has to arrive at. Because the Ingalls family did not just erase James's illness from the story they told, they erected their warmth on land that was not theirs. The big woods of Wisconsin, the Prairie claim in Kansas, the homestead in Dakota Territory, the places that held the fiddle music and the candlelight and the family warm inside against the cold, those places had been someone else's home before the Ingalls arrived. The Osage in Kansas, the Dakota in Minnesota, the various indigenous nations whose relationship to the land the Ingalls and thousands of families like them were claiming under the Homestead Act, which was, among other things, a mechanism for transferring land from people who had lived on it for generations to people who had recently arrived from somewhere else. The books do not say that plainly. The books say, in the voice of a child who was 4 years old when she absorbed this world and 65 when she wrote it down, what the culture of that child's formation said, that the land was empty, were, or nearly so, or occupied by people who did not count the way that the people inside the warm house counted. Laura did not invent that worldview. She inherited it, breathed it, was made by it, the way all of us are made by the assumptions of the world we grow up inside before we have the language to examine them. But she put it in books, and the books went into classrooms, and a little girl on the Upper Sioux Reservation came home crying. This is where everything we have been building across this entire story converges, not to a verdict, not to a sentence that ends it cleanly, but to a reckoning. The story of the Ingalls brothers, Hiram and James serving in Tennessee while George stayed home, James coming back thin and sick and pretty tame, the myth that grew up around George's wildness, and the drummer boy who never existed. That story is, in miniature, the same story as the larger one. It is the story of what we choose to carry forward and what we choose to leave behind. It is the story of the myth that a family builds to survive its own damage, and the larger myth that a nation builds to survive its own. The family myth erased James. It gave his sacrifice to George. It protected the warmth of the story by keeping the cost of the story outside the frame. The national myth did the same thing at a scale that the family myth never reached. It erased the actual experience of the Civil War's invisible casualties, the sick men, the garrison soldiers, the men who served without being in a famous battle, and replaced it with drummer boys and brass buttons and the bright, illegible drama of heroic sacrifice. It erased the history of the land the pioneers were claiming, the people who were displaced, the violence that made the settlement possible, the specific human cost of the westward expansion that the books present as adventure and opportunity, and replaced it with the warm light inside the little house. And Laura Ingalls Wilder, standing at the intersection of these two myths, became the most widely read chronicler of both. Not because she was dishonest, because she was human, because she did what humans do with the things that are too heavy to carry in plain sight. She made them beautiful, and the beauty worked. So here is the question that has no clean answer. What do you do with something that is both beautiful and incomplete? The scholars who have done the most careful work on this, Fraser, Hill, the Pioneer Girl Project, the contributors to the 2023 collection Reconsidering Laura Ingalls Wilder, they do not offer a simple answer to that question. What they offer instead is a practice, the practice of reading with both eyes open, of holding the warmth in one hand and the cost of the warmth in the other, and not letting go of either, of saying, I love these books, I love what they gave me, I love the specific feeling of being 4 years old and having someone read to you about a little girl named Laura, who lived in a world that was hard and cold and dangerous, and who was loved completely inside it. And also, I see James, I see Hiram, I see the 8-year-old girl who came home crying, and also I see the woman and the drawer, the manuscript in the drawer, like the medal in the drawer, the harder version of the story that Laura wrote once and never published, the one where the resolution did not come and the house burned and the baby died and the hardship just sat there. I see all of it. That is the practice, not rejection, not uncritical love, the harder thing, the full picture, held together, not collapsed into a verdict. On October 23rd, 1949, Almanzo Wilder died at Rocky Ridge Farm. He was 92 years old. He and Laura had been married for 64 years. Laura was 82 and alone and had no intention of leaving the farm. For the next 7 years and 4 months she answered fan letters by hand. She welcomed strangers who drove to her door unannounced, wanting to see the woman whose books had given them something they could not fully name. She held the Garth Williams illustrations and saw her childhood given back to her in someone else's vision, and said nothing publicly about whether it looked right. She put the ALA medal in a drawer. She kept the harder manuscript in its drawer too, the version of her life that did not have room for the fiddle. She put it in the drawer and she left it there. And when she died, in her sleep, 3 days after turning 90, the farmhouse went quiet. And 14 years later, in 1971, the first 4 years was published. And readers picked it up. Readers who had grown up with the warm books and felt something shift, something settle into a different shape. Not worse, not better, just truer, more complete. The version of Laura that included the drawer, the version that knew what it was leaving out. Here is where this whole story has been taking you. Not to the conclusion that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a fraud, not to the conclusion that the Little House books should be put away, or that the love people have carried for them across generations is misplaced, or that the warmth they contain is false because it was built on top of things that were harder and darker and more complicated than the books admit. Here is where it has been taking you, to James. Standing in that room in Wisconsin, sometime in the early 1870s, thin and pale and carrying in his body the price of a year he gave to his country in a garrison in Tennessee. A small girl looking at him with the total unguarded attention of a child who does not yet know that some questions are the kind that adults have learned not to ask. Are you wild too? And James, steady, undramatic, honest in the specific way of people who have nothing to prove and no particular interest in being made into a story. Answering her. Pretty tame. He gave her the truth, and she held it for 60 years. And somewhere in the process of turning it into a book, she made a choice. Not a wrong choice, not a right one. A human choice, shaped by love and limitation, and the particular cultural weather of the America she was writing in and for. She chose the version that could be carried forward. She chose the fire. She chose the fiddle. She chose George in the blue coat, brass buttons catching the light, the bugle lifted, the dance beginning, and Pa's warm voice explaining to a small girl with dark hair and quick eyes exactly what the war had made of that man, and why it was all right, and why the music would continue, and why the family was warm inside the cold, and why none of the dark things outside the circle of the light had the final word. She chose all of that, and the real Laura Ingalls Wilder, the one with the harder manuscript in the drawer and the medal she put away and the knowledge of what she was choosing and what she was setting aside. That Laura knew it too. She just knew what the fiddle was for, and the fiddle was for the living. James Ingalls died sometime in the early 20th century, as men of his generation did, in the quiet way of people who live their whole lives without leaving the kind of record that makes them easy to follow. He is not in a monument. He is not in a museum. He is not in the book his niece wrote about the family he belonged to. He is in a muster roll, Company E, 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery, his name entered in January of 1865 by a recruiter in Lake City, Minnesota. His presence confirmed on every roll call through 9 months of garrison duty in Chattanooga. His discharge recorded at Nashville on September 27, 1865. He's in a pension file, or the absence of one. He's in a manuscript fragment in 3 words, in his own voice, or the closest thing to his own voice that the historical record preserves. Pretty tame. He is in this story tonight because someone finally went looking, and the archives kept him. They always do, if you know where to look. The archives keep everyone, the ones who made the myth, and the ones who paid for it, and the ones who simply went where they were needed and came home changed and called themselves pretty tame, and went on living in the quiet way that people live when no one is writing their story down. They are all there, waiting, for someone who wants the full picture instead of just the fire. Thank you for staying with this, all the way to the end.